Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and power is a corrupting force. A corrupting force. We've witnessed this throughout history. We've been warned about this time and time again. It's something the Founding Fathers spoke about quite often. And if you ever read their works, their personal works, and when they were developing the Constitution, you see this argument being made that you have to be wary of those in power. That's why they preferred limited government. It's why they instituted safeguards. It's why last week I did an episode talking about limited government. So if you haven't listened to that episode, make sure you check it out. And if we look at the system of checks and balances, there is a reason Congress has far more checks over the other two branches in government. The founders wanted power in the hands of the many as opposed to the few. However, over the last 2 decades, I can easily argue that it's no longer that way. We have witnessed Congress surrender their power and authority to the executive branch through various departments and agencies. We have seen so many in positions of power abuse that power. And the last few years have proven that, right? These departments and agencies, they can't be trusted with the power as they have routinely abused it. When our institutions become politically weaponized by the bureaucrats, who are nothing more than ideologues, they're the ones that are the real threat to society. And sadly, you have a general public that doesn't care that they've been consistently lied to, that they've been consistently manipulated. So many are too blind to see that in a free society, this is not the way it's supposed to operate. And they pretend that we still live in this free society. Then you have those who expose government misinformation and censorship. And the amazing part is, last week we had congressional hearings all week. It's clear. So many in Congress could care less about the abuses of power. Many of them actually applaud it. Not only are they applauding it, they're willing to empower the federal departments and agencies even more, as long as those who run these agencies to continue to push a political agenda that they agree with. They are so short-sighted. They don't see how, if the roles get reversed, they're going to be very upset at what would be going on. But right now they don't care because it's their political agenda that's getting pushed. And they are willing to further empower those who have already proven that they have no regard for the Constitution. They have no regard for our God-given liberties. The media has all but ignored several major stories in the last week that everyone should be aware of. And maybe if ordinary people were aware of the abuses of power, maybe if it was clearly spelled out for them, maybe then they would say enough is enough. Maybe then they would call in to rein the out-of-control agencies and departments. I'm going to explain it all. Before I do, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Go to the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, sign up for the newsletter, and share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. And before I jump to the main topic, I have to touch on the bank collapses, right? We've seen 2 bank collapses in the last week, Silicon Valley Bank and then Signature Bank. And it relates to today's topic because it's an issue of competency. I mean, for somehow, some way, the most incompetent people now lead some of the most important institutions within our society. I don't know how it got this way, but it's remarkable when you think of the idea of doing your job and perfection. It no longer exists in society. The idea of just being a competent human being no longer exists. Instead, we just cycle through people. Okay, people that don't deserve to run anything are now leading almost every institution, whether it's in government or it's in the private sector, and we see this time and time again. Sadly, we are the ones that end up suffering. I hope you haven't looked at your 401ks or IRAs in the last few days because it's been pretty ugly. And when something like this happens, we see the fear porn gets ramped up, just like everything else we've lived through over the last few years. They want to create a sense of panic in the hopes that government is going to swoop in and bail them out. They're screaming about a contagion that's going to potentially create this domino effect. It will have ripple effects throughout the entire country. See, the purpose to create this sense of fear that other banks are going to collapse and it's going to be a run on our financial institutions. They're aware that the panic's going to drive people to withdraw money from their bank accounts, thereby creating the self-fulfilling prophecy. Obviously, if the last few years have shown us anything, it's that the fear porn works. I'm not saying that there's no effects from these bank collapses. Of course there are. And this collapse is a problem for ordinary Americans. It's a problem for startups that had their accounts there. It's a problem for emerging small businesses. It's a problem for big companies like Roku and Roblox. Anyone with kids knows Roblox is a bottomless money pit for parents. But we're already starting to hear the too big to fail mantra. It's already starting again. It's like a flashback to 2008. And the frightening aspect to this is that when we look at a bank like Silicon Valley Bank, it has nearly $200 billion in deposits with 97% of accounts above the $250,000 FDIC insurance threshold. There are a lot of people who could potentially get hurt by this. However, it does not mean that the government should come in and bail the bank out. Capitalism works if you allow it to. Part of the problem and part of the reason that we got to this point is because we don't live in a capitalist society. We don't let capitalism play itself out. We've artificially manipulated the economy for decades. But if you let capitalism work, it solves the problem. We already have Democrats now calling for more regulations. When a bank is over-leveraged and is mismanaged, a collapse shouldn't be shocking. It should serve as a notice to other institutions so that other institutions don't make the same mistakes. And those in charge of Silicon Valley Bank or Signature Bank, they should be held accountable. Whether it's the executives in charge, you also have the Federal Reserve in these areas, the San Francisco Federal Reserve, New York Federal Reserve. They should have been aware that this could be a problem. But if you let these banks fail, other banks will take notice and they are going to change their policies to make sure that they manage their bank responsibly. Now, whether the executives were incompetent or something more nefarious was going on remains to be seen. Only time's going to tell that. We have to see what happens. What we do know is that top executives at Silicon Valley Bank sold nearly $5 million worth of stocks 2 weeks prior to the collapse. That certainly needs to be investigated, and if they sold the stock based on insider knowledge, they need to be held accountable. Enough with the top executive making tons of money as they run these companies into the ground. But getting back to the point, our economy has been so artificially manipulated that when something like this happens, no one should be surprised. The fact is, many of the major banks, I'm talking about your JP Morgan Chase, Capital One, Bank of America, these banks are fiscally sound. Okay, they're not going to have this issue. They've been taking the rising interest rates into account the entire time. They aren't over leveraged like these smaller banks were. But again, it gets back to that idea of capitalism, right? So if banks feel that they're going to get government bailout, they're going to be willing to take much more risk. And I've been warning about the artificial manipulation of our economy for quite some time. Of course, it will be we, the hardworking Americans, we're going to be the ones that suffer. So far, you have Secretary Yellen. She said a bailout isn't happening, and I applaud that. That's the way it should be. But how long are they going to be able to hold out? How long are they going to be able to withstand the fear porn that's being put out there? How long before the pressure gets too much and they begin to start to capitulate? And the same holds true for members of Congress, right? Because ultimately they'd be the ones that have to approve any type of bailout. So we have to look at this. This is a problem in our society. There's no doubt that people are going to get hurt in the process, but we need to let the economy work itself out as opposed to looking to the government for every single thing that happens. Because guess what? The pizza place that's struggling to make ends meet may go out of business within the next several months or a year. They're not getting a bailout. The person that took a risk and decided to open up a bar, they're not getting a bailout. You know, we have so many small businesses that go in and out of business each and every year. They never receive bailouts. Yet for those that have connections, for those that are in positions of power, well, they're the ones that get the bailout. It's completely ridiculous. It's time to flush our economy and actually bring back in capitalism. You have Democrats calling for new regulations to go on, and that is not the answer. You don't need more regulations. You actually need less of them. Again, there's not always a government solution to everything. Sometimes we have to be responsible for the decisions we make. Same holds true for those in business, in industry. It doesn't make a difference. You have to be held accountable instead of running in and looking to the government to come in to fix the problem. And then they only make the problem worse. Remember, they were responsible for the 2007-2008 mortgage meltdown crisis when they forced banks to give mortgages and these variable mortgages to anyone and everyone, even if they don't qualify. People making $50,000 a year buying a $700,000 home. It's policies like that create this problem in the first place. So maybe we need less government, not more government. I find you have two groups of people, right? You have groups of people that are so quick to criticize government. They're suspicious of government. They don't want to see government have power. Then something goes wrong and they call on government to get involved and intervene. Then there's the other ones that are too trusting of government. That the second something happens, they believe government is the answer to the solution. Unfortunately, people like me are rare dinosaurs in this day and age, where we actually live by the creed of limited government. In any event, we're going to take a quick break. When I get back, I want to talk about how those in power have abdicated their responsibilities and how we see massive government abuses. We've witnessed it all last week, and I'm going to break it down for you. So we'll be right back. As someone who worked in emergency management, I routinely sounded the alarm bells on our outdated grid system. Think back to 2003 when a tree branch hit a power line in Ohio, shutting down power to the entire eastern seaboard. Around 100 people died, and this was one of the costliest disasters in American history, with losses totaling over $60 billion. Even the White House sees it. They're saying 2/3 of the grid are at least 25 years old, and they recently announced billions of dollars to update it. But we're talking about the government here. How long do you think that's going to take, if at all? When an incident happens, you have to rely on yourself. Be prepared for yourself and your family. With the Patriot Power Generator, you get a solar generator that doesn't install into your house because it's portable. You can take it with you, even use it inside. But it's powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, and even your fridge. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the Patriot Power Generator. You'll also get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. A portion of every sale is donated to charities who support veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off. That's 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get yours today. Welcome back, everyone. And last week, I outlined government abuses over the last 15 years. I went through an extensive list of each agency and department, and it was actually things that I could think of off the top of my head. Imagine if I took the time out and researched and wrote everything down, there would be a lot more I'd provide to you. However, last week we witnessed several congressional hearings, and you may be unaware of these hearings because, God forbid, our media covered it. They didn't. They hid it. And when some of them did actually cover it, all they did was try and downplay the importance of these hearings. But these hearings were critical because they focused on government misinformation, disinformation, and censorship. The reason that the media is not covering it is because it goes against narratives and policies that they all helped push. See, over the last several years, the lines between the media, the government, those in power, they become obliterated. They're blurred. You don't really know where they begin and end because it's almost as if they're all one and the same entity. And you've been lied to. You've been manipulated. We constantly hear misinformation, disinformation. It's a threat to democracy. When are you going to realize that the government and many of the top-level bureaucrats who run the government have been the largest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation? When are we going to get that through our skulls? Why do we allow them to sit there and try and dictate what's misinformation and disinformation when they put out so many lies, when they've manipulated, when they've tried to censor, when they've clearly abused their power? Why do we listen to them when they talk about misinformation and disinformation? These people in power, they use their power in positions within our government to silence, censor, demonize, destroy anyone who went against their narrative. Take someone like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Dr. Martin Kulldorff, and Dr. Sunetra Gupta. These were all well-respected people in the field of science and research until they dared to challenge the embodiment of science himself, Lord Fauci. During COVID, you had Drs. Bhattacharya, Kulldorff, and Gupta. They had the cojones to challenge the CDC and the National Institute of Health narrative. They had the cojones to challenge the response and the recommendations that were provided. They explained how lockdowns, mask mandates, and other mandates were causing more harm than the virus itself. They used a common sense approach. I know, it's mind-boggling in this day and age. God forbid we call for resources to be focused on those who are most vulnerable. God forbid we give resources to hospitals so that they could handle the surge. God forbid we let everyone live their lives as normal. Instead of doing that, we went full-blown Mussolini. Now, at a congressional hearing last week, an email from the head of the NIH, Francis Collins, was sent to Lord Fauci. And this email was already published. We actually already knew about it, but it's important to bring it up again because in the email, Francis Collins is writing to Lord Fauci. And it was about the Great Barrington Declaration. It was about Dr. Bhattacharya, Dr. Koldroff, Dr. Gupta. And in this email, she states, quote, this proposal from 3 fringe epidemiologists who met with the secretary seems to be getting a lot of attention, and even a co-signature from Nobel Prize winner Mike Leavitt at Stanford. There needs to be a quick and devastating takedown, published takedown of its premises. I don't see anything like that online yet. Is it underway? End quote. Now, first of all, these were not fringe epidemiologists. These were and remain well-respected epidemiologists at Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford. They have over 300 peer-reviewed articles combined amongst them. Their work has been cited thousands of times prior to the coronavirus. So they weren't fringe scientists. They were actually well-respected in their field. A Nobel Prize winner, Mike Leavitt, is not a fringe person. And the fact that you would have a coordinated government effort to target them all because they dared to challenge Lord Fauci himself, all because they dared to challenge the National Institute of Health, it should tell you everything that you need to know. These same fools kept regurgitating, trust the science, trust the science. But it wasn't about the science. It didn't matter about the science. When they said trust the science, they meant trust the science that we're telling you to follow, not the real science that actually exists. And the reason they do that is because they didn't care about science itself. They cared about power. It's why any time they were criticized by people with the knowledge to actually push back, they saw them as a threat. And they were using government resources to engage in character assassination of good people. Not for nothing, but the Lord Fauci's of the world deserve to be in prison. And I don't say that lightly. I know Fauci's complaining that people are calling for him to be in prison. But the reality is the damage he inflicted on our society. Then he had the nerve to try and cover it up. Then he had the nerve to actually lie to Congress. I mean, don't forget, he told the Senate that the United States doesn't fund gain-of-function research, when clearly we do fund gain-of-function research. Then the little sniveling weasel that he is, the NIH website was updated to change the definition of what gain-of-function actually means. So he did lie to Congress. He did perjure himself. And when you're using government resources to attack other individuals in order to assassinate their character, there are probably several criminal statutes that go against that. So I'm sure we could find more than just a perjury charge on him. But getting to my point, according to Robert Redfield, because he was testifying, and he is important because he was the then CDC director, apparently Lord Fauci was boxing him out of meetings because Dr. Redfield dared to say that with all the evidence he's seen, he believed the likely source of COVID was from a lab leak at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the weasel Lord Fauci didn't like that, of course. Can't go against his narrative. He didn't want people to know that he was the one that was approving funding for Wuhan Institute of Virology. Here's the amazing part. Fauci received emails from 2 colleagues where they said that all indications look like that it came from the Wuhan lab. Now, Fauci couldn't have that, so after a back and forth, all of a sudden, the same 2 that emailed him that they said this has all the hallmarks of a lab-initiated virus, all of a sudden came to a different conclusion. They said now it looks like that it was a virus that was obtained naturally. Maybe it was a wet market, maybe it was a bat in a cave, who knows, but it was obtained naturally. Understand that in government there are no coincidences. And I will readily admit that I don't have evidence of a crime being committed, but if 2 people who initially thought it came from the Wuhan lab, at the same time Lord Fauci was pushing that it was natural, then they happen to change their opinion within a few days, and 3 months later they are awarded a $9 million government grant, that to me is a little suspicious. I'm just saying, when you come to one thing, change your mind a few days later, to fall in line with the narrative that Lord Fauci wanted to portray to everyone, and then 3 months later, you're awarded $9 million?
Come on, give me a break, man.
But we're just supposed to believe whatever Fauci says, right? He's on his little media tour right now. He's on his media tour, and the guy is such a weasel. He was on Fox News' Neil Cavuto show, and he said he's now open to the lab leak theory. It only took him 3 years to get there, but now he's open about it. And now people could talk about it without fear that they're going to be silenced or censored or marginalized or attacked. But in typical weasel fashion, because only a weasel could act this way, here's what Lord Fauci is saying when it comes to the lab leak theory.
And on this theory of a lab leak, I've been wondering this. Do we have any idea how that would even work? Have you heard any accounts as to how that might have happened? Is there speculation in the scientific community as to how that happened?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Jim. So one of the things that people maybe don't fully appreciate, that all of the intelligence agencies agree unanimously that this was not engineered. Namely, they didn't deliberately do this to make a bioweapon. Everybody agrees with that. No matter what your prior thoughts were, everybody agrees with that. A lab leak could be that someone was out in the wild, maybe looking for different types of viruses in bats, got infected, went into a lab, and was being studied in a lab, and then it came out of the lab. But if that's the definition of a lab leak, Jim, then that still is a natural occurrence.
Not for nothing, but I'll give Fauci credit for one thing. I will give him credit for having the cojones to come out there and essentially say to the American people that you are so stupid that you will believe anything he says. He thinks you are so dumb that he could say the most absurd things and people will still believe him. It's not like they were working on COVID strains at Wuhan and someone accidentally got infected and spread it like a wildfire. No, that couldn't possibly be it. Instead, Fauci wants us to believe that someone who worked at the Wuhan lab was in nature, was infected by a bat while in nature, and then went to work infecting others at the Wuhan lab. Even though we still haven't found the bat with this particular coronavirus strain. So keep that in mind, as if the government officials of China haven't been searching for a bat that can match it so they could say, see, it was natural. It wasn't the Wuhan lab. I mean, he must really think people are that dumb. But then again, there were the Lord Fauci candles and people actually bought them. People put signs of Lord Fauci on their front lawns. You still have people wearing masks while driving alone in a car. So what does that tell us? You've been lied to over and over again, and there's so many people that will still defend the lockdowns. They'll still defend the mask mandates. They'll still defend Lord Fauci. They'll say, oh, the science changed. The science evolved. No, it actually didn't. That's why you had people like Dr. Bhattacharya, Dr. Koldorf, and Dr. Gupta at nearly the beginning of this thing raising the red flag saying that, hey, we're not following the science. The science didn't evolve. The politics of the virus evolved. That's what evolved. And Fauci got caught. And I think that's what frustrates me more than anything. You see the damage that was inflicted on our country, damage that's going to be here for decades. We're seeing it in the classrooms. We're seeing it in our neighborhoods. We're seeing it all over the country. Damage from the lockdowns, masks, vaccine mandates, you name it. You see all this damage, and not a single person within our government bureaucracy has been held accountable. No one at the federal level or the state level. And it's so frustrating, especially when you consider that these policies had no real impact on stopping the spread and transmission of the virus, and the drawbacks outweighed anything. And it was so easy to see. I mean, listen, I'm not sitting here saying I'm a rocket scientist, but I've been saying this since pretty much the start of the coronavirus. Emergency management isn't rocket science. That's another thing that frustrates me. All the emergency managers throughout this country that abdicated their responsibility and let the CDC drive the train, where they were boxed out, their positions were marginalized, and they had no say in the policies. I don't believe in government mandates, but if you are going to mandate something, you better damn well know what the negative impacts are going to be. You better know what the long-term consequences are going to be before you force people to do something. And these bureaucratic officials, people like Lord Fauci, Francis Collins, they don't even admit they were wrong. Very few people have come out and said, hey, listen, we went a little too far when it came to the coronavirus, and we should make sure that never happens again. Instead, the science evolved. This was one of the biggest frauds ever perpetrated on the American people, and it continues to this day. It's so screwed up. And unfortunately, how many had their reputations destroyed? How many people in the medical community were fired or terminated because they spoke out against these policies? They were marginalized. You had doctors losing their license. People getting fired because they wouldn't get the vaccine. And they lied to us. And yet people will still defend them to this day. It's bizarre. And you have people like Lord Fauci now trying to cover their ass. Shouldn't work. Shouldn't be allowed. And the media shouldn't give this guy the time of day anymore. He doesn't say anything useful. He doesn't say anything beneficial. All he does is attack anyone that tries to criticize him. All he does is say everyone else is lying. He's the only one that doesn't lie. That he doesn't understand how everyone could be this way. It's ridiculous, but it speaks to a much larger problem, a much bigger and more widespread abuse of government power. It's been going on for a while, yet so many have ignored the increasing power and influence of government. They've ignored the lines, the barrier between the media and government be obliterated, the lines between the tech giants and government be obliterated, the lines between the government and the big corporations get obliterated. But the COVID response wasn't the only hearings that were taking place last week. There was also a discussion of the weaponization of government and government censorship that was front and center. And you had two journalists, Matt Taibbi and Michael Shellenberger, who were testifying on Capitol Hill. They were there to speak about the Twitter files, and the reaction by Democrats was revealing. Now, keep in mind that Taibbi and Shellenberger aren't some far-right conservatives. I mean, it's not like they would agree with me on many issues. We would agree on abuse of power. We would agree on upholding liberty and the First Amendment in particular, which is the most important. But these are liberals who value the Constitution. They value free speech. They value freedom of the press. They're liberals who actually understand what it means to be liberal. They question government power. They're suspicious of it, and they call out the abuses of power as the modern left cheers on these abuses. And I want to play a sound clip of Matt Taibbi's opening remarks because they are important. It's a few minutes, but it's worth the listen to. Take a listen.
I'm here today because of a series of events that began late last year when I received a note from a source online. It read, "Are you interested in doing a deep dive into what censorship and manipulation was going on at Twitter?" A week later, the first of what became known as the Twitter Files reports came out. To say these attracted intense public interest would be an understatement. My computer looked like a Vegas slot machine, just the first tweet about the blockage of the Hunter Biden laptop story registered 143 million impressions and 30 million engagements. But it wasn't until a week after the first report, after Michael Shellenberger, Barry Weiss, and other researchers joined the search of the files, that we started to grasp the significance of this story. The original promise of the internet was that it might democratize the exchange of information globally. A free internet would overwhelm all attempts to control information flow, its very existence a threat to anti-democratic forms of government everywhere. What we found in the files was a sweeping effort to reverse that promise and use machine learning and other tools to turn the internet into an instrument of censorship and social control. Unfortunately, our own government appears to be playing a lead role. We saw the first hints in communications between Twitter executives before the 2020 election, when we read things like "flagged by DHS" or "please see attached report from FBI for potential misinformation." This would be attached to an Excel spreadsheet with a long list of names whose accounts were often suspended shortly after. Again, Ranking Member Plaskett, I would note that the evidence of Twitter-government relationship includes lists of tens of thousands of names on both the left and right. The people affected include Trump supporters, but also left-leaning sites like Consortium and Truth Out, the leftist South American channel Telesur, the Yellow Vest movement. That, in fact, is a key point of the Twitter files, that it's neither a left nor right issue. Following the trail of communications between Twitter and the federal government across tens of thousands of emails led to a series of revelations. Mr. Chairman, we summarized and submitted them to the committee in the form of a new Twitter files thread, which was also released to the public this morning. We learned Twitter, Facebook, Google, and other companies developed a formal system for taking in moderation requests from every corner of government, from the FBI, the DHS, the HHS, DOD, the Global Engagement Center at State, even the CIA. For every government agency scanning Twitter, there were perhaps 20 quasi-private entities doing the same thing, including Stanford's Election Integrity Partnership, NewsGuard, the Global Disinformation Index, and many others, many taxpayer-funded. A focus of this fast-growing network, as Mike noted, is making lists of people whose opinions, beliefs, associations, or sympathies are deemed misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation. That last term is just a euphemism for true but inconvenient. Undeniably, the making of such lists is a form of digital McCarthyism. Ordinary Americans are not just being reported to Twitter for de-amplification or deplatforming, but to firms like PayPal, digital advertisers like Xandr, and crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe. These companies can and do refuse service to law-abiding people and businesses whose only crime is falling afoul of a distant, faceless, unaccountable, algorithmic judge. As someone who grew up a traditional ACLU liberal, this mechanism for punishment and deprivation without due process is horrifying. Another troubling aspect is the role of the press, which should be the people's last line of defense in such cases. But instead of investigating these groups, journalists partnered with them. If Twitter declined to remove an account right away, government agencies and NGOs would call reporters for the New York Times, Washington Post, and other outlets, who in turn would call Twitter demanding to know why action had not yet been taken. Effectively, news media became an arm of a state-sponsored thought policing system. I'm running out of time, so I'll just sum up and say, It's just not possible to instantly arrive at truth. It is, however, possible, becoming technologically possible to instantly define and enforce a political consensus online, which I believe is what we're looking at. This is a grave threat to people of all political persuasions. The First Amendment and an American population accustomed to the right to speak is the best defense left against the censorship industrial complex. If the latter can knock over our first and most important constitutional guarantee, these groups will have no serious opponent left anywhere. If there's anything the Twitter files show, it's that we're in danger of losing this most precious right, without which all democratic rights are impossible. Thank you for the opportunity to appear.
Now, Taibbi was savaged by the Democrats. You had Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett refer to him as a so-called journalist, even though Taibbi has received numerous journalism awards. Congressman Dan Goodman suggested that there's not a single example of the government censoring lawful speech. That is a blatant lie. That is an easily verifiable lie. When Miranda Devine reported on Hunter Biden's laptop and then the censorship minions came out and censored her, the New York Post, and anyone else that retweeted or put the link in their tweets were censored. That right there, I didn't even have to do any type of research. It didn't take me long to dig that out. That right there was lawful government speech being censored. Was lawful speech being censored, not government speech. It went against the government censorship minions. And we have numerous examples of this. I mean, just look at anyone that was questioning the idea of the vaccine. Look at anyone that was questioning the idea of mask mandates. Look at anyone that was questioning the concept of Bountygate, where Russians were paying the Taliban officials to kill American soldiers. Okay, those people had their accounts censored. So when we're looking at that, you have too many Democrats, you have too many national security experts, mainstream journalists. They are in the position and arguing that tweets are spreading disinformation, undermining American democracy, even if the speech contains truthful information, but yet they have to silence and censor people because of the false assumption that Russian influence on social media corrupted the 2016 election and led to Trump's victory somehow. That's how demented these people are. That they'll sit there, they'll call for censorship, they'll call and scream about misinformation and disinformation, even though they're the ones that are actually pushing out disinformation and misinformation. People need to get over this idea of disinformation and misinformation and don't empower the government to target disinformation and misinformation. The reality is that governments will use that as a weapon. Those in power will apply disinformation and misinformation to whatever doesn't fit their narrative. This is not me coming at this from a conservative point of view. If conservatives are in power, I don't want conservatives determining what can be said and what can't be said. I don't want conservatives to sit there and destroy the lives of individuals based on difference of political opinion. When it comes to misinformation and disinformation, what I don't want is government to claim to be the ones to determine that anyone that speaks out against their narrative and their policies is somehow expressing anti-government or anti-authority sentiments. It's a very dangerous path as we're going down this road. And the fact that you have Democrats at these hearings that are trying to destroy the reputations of those that are sounding the alarm bells is disgraceful. Because Democrats should be just as concerned as Republicans. Sooner or later, the shoe will be on the other foot, and the Democrats aren't going to like it. This is why limited government is important. This is why we need to take power away from the government and stop looking to the government to solve every single problem that exists. Whether it's misinformation or disinformation, or whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the bank meltdown that we're starting to see in a couple of banks, government is not the answer. Remember the last time that the government bailed out the banks? And remember when they bailed out the banks, all of a sudden those companies started to become really political, right? The banks started taking political positions on the issues. Do you think that has anything to do with the money they received in the bank bailouts? Maybe we should think about that. Maybe we should ponder that. So maybe we have to be careful when we're calling on government to exercise more power. More power is what's gotten us into this mess. And the only way to fix it is to reduce the power of government. I hope you found this episode informative. If you did, please share it with your family, friends, on social media. Also, I appreciate any 5-star ratings, written reviews on any podcast platform that allows it. For now, I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.